Yeah, what up? What up, everybody? It's me, Al. I'm here with Jeff for your Sunday School Bonanza.
You sound really enthusiastic right now.
Well, you got me early in the morning. This is early, Jeff.
Yo, what's up? I'm Al. We're here doing the Sunday School Bonanza.
It's not easy to be gangster, Jeff.
I know. No, this I know all too well. I was raised...
Listen, I had my Greek yogurt. I'm working through some corn nuts right now, which you forbade me to eat during recording, so I'm just watching them. But like, I'm getting there. Got to get my energy.
Okay, good man. Al, it's nice.
How are you, Jeff? It's been a while.
It's been a while. We won't do a ton of banter here. It's very nice to have you back here doing some Sunday School Bonanza with the peeps.
Excited to be here.
Al will still be joining us, time and again here and there for the SSB. So
willy-nilly, however I choose.
And this week we have a terrific lesson.
So the lesson this week, lesson number 4, the things which I saw while I was carried away in the Spirit.
Yeah, so here... go ahead.
First Nephi 12-14.
Yep. Basically straight ahead, there's a brief attention activity they might mention, which involves making a timeline.
It seems like a mistake.
Of events. I guess it sort of makes sense, but I don't see it happening, but we'll see what goes down. So in this, we talk a lot about Nephi's vision and things along those lines. Starting off, that Nephi, in the first section, of course, sees the future of his descendants and his brother's descendants. And this is, of course, in 1 Nephi 12. So here's a question for you. How did Nephi describe the conditions on the earth that would precede the Savior's visit to America? What were those offhand? Anybody? Bueller?
How did he describe them? They were bad.
They were terrible.
Yeah, bad.
Yeah, not a good time at all.
That's kind of a rough. Like, could you imagine being like, all right, I'm going to show you all your kids, and they're wicked and going to die. You're like, oh, well, I kind of could have done without seeing that. I had a little more hope before this. I mean, that's got to be a hard thing to show somebody.
Yeah. So
so
anyway, so that's in 1 Nephi 12:1-6, and then we compare that to how these conditions were similar to the conditions that would precede the Savior's second coming. And I think that's very true. We saw how much wickedness there was among the Nephites immediately before all of that. And, of course, how are we doing nowadays? We don't know when the second coming is, but the world appears to be slowly in decline.
Wait, are we supposed to compare that, or did Nephi compare? Was he shown both?
No. We are to compare that. We're drawing parallels.
I understand where you're going now.
You sure about that? So anyway, after 4 generations of righteousness, there would be wickedness, and then we move on to the second section. Nephi sees the. Do you want this, Al? Go ahead.
Yeah, let me take the first half here.
Take the first half.
Nephi sees the formation of the great and abominable church, the colonization of America, the apostasy, and the restoration of the gospel. So those 4. What's interesting to me about this is why those 4 were the chosen few. If you've got a limited amount of time and space and stuff that you can show somebody things, we get to see the rise of a crummy church, America, the good church fall away, and then restoring the good church.
Yeah, pretty much.
Right. So I don't know. Does that not seem odd that those would be the 4 things that were like if God had to come down and show you a great vision, he would pick those 4?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess I get what you're saying, but I suppose when you look at the whole idea of the great and abominable church, which is the first part about that, about how much that affects the children of God into leading them into apostasy or what have you. And of course, like Elder McConkie said, there's always been a lot of debate. Many people have said is the great and abominable church, the Catholic Church, because it is so huge and this and that. Especially when you're on the mission. I served in a Catholic country. We heard this a lot, as if it was like, oh yeah, this is it. But Elder McConkie said, quote, "The titles Church of the Devil and Great and Abominable Church are used to identify all churches or organizations of whatever name or nature, whether political, philosophical, educational, economic, social, fraternal, civic, or religious, which are designed to take men on a course that leads them away from God."
So that's in 1966. I think that was right after, in the first edition of Mormon Doctrine, he specifically writes in the preface that it did refer to the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I've heard that before. So
and then that's removed in the second edition. I think it was the second edition.
Yeah, because Elder McConkie, or President McConkie, laid the smackdown on him.
President McConkie laid the smackdown on Elder McConkie?
Sorry, President McKay. McKay.
Well, and I think what this, yeah, well, I mean, and it makes a little bit more sense there. And so, like, if you're Nephi, though, this is relevant because, you know, you're coming to America. These are all things that directly affect you and your descendants. So, you know, as a father of nations, it makes good sense. I was just being a little bit facetious before.
Yeah.
You know. And then discovering America, that's got to be a little promising. You're like, here we are in this land that nobody is in, and it will be discovered and populated and great.
Yeah, it is pretty cool how it says right there in, what is that, 1 Nephi 13:12. You know, it says, "And I looked and beheld a man among the Gentiles who was separated from the seed of my brethren by the many waters. And I beheld the Spirit of God, and it came down and wrought upon the man. And he went forth upon the many waters, even unto the seed of my brethren who were in the promised land." So, interesting to have a vision of Columbus. Interesting that it says, you know, the Spirit was upon him. I guess in one way or another that might be true, because, you know, there are many who think it's funny that we celebrate Columbus Day because we're celebrating a guy who came and slaughtered native civilizations. But hey,
yeah,
but it was a necessary step, like, for the restoration of the gospel eventually.
Well, then I wonder what value showing the apostasy had to Nephi. Like, well, except to make way for showing the restoration, right?
Yeah.
Like, why else would you want to see? You know, would you need to see the apostasy?
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I imagine being in Nephi's shoes, how would you not despair, in a sense, when you see a vision like this? How do you maintain hope when you know these things are going to transpire? You know, how do you still be excited for your people to do this stuff when you know in the end the Nephites are going to fail? You know, I think it's very interesting, and it's, at the same token, how do we, when we know the way the world is going and the way it's going to have to be before the second coming, how do we also maintain hope and happiness and drive to do what's right?
Well, what's interesting is with all the difficulty, right? Like, essentially, he says your entire posterity is going to fall away, and they're going to leave.
Yeah, it's harsh.
But as is the case with us, the hope comes in the restoration, right?
Precisely.
Like it just kind of creates a place for that to be more meaningful, by understanding that it's all going to go away. But, like, how beautiful is the restoration that comes and gathers your posterity back in?
Well, I think, and that's interesting when we see the arc of the lesson, because after seeing all of this loss, like, afterwards we see the apostasy and the many plain and precious parts of the Bible that'll be distorted. That's all in 1 Nephi 13. Then we talk about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, the restoration of the gospel. So it's interesting that the Spirit sort of showed him the fall of man, but that there would be a restoration later on, which is analogous in essence to being redeemed, in a sense, I think. To seeing the very spiritual fall of man and the need for a Savior, at the same time seeing the fall and the weighing of the church. Yep. And the restoration of it.
Well, on top of that, we also see the great and abominable church
for sure
falling as well, right? So, like, the restoration comes and happens, good is restored, and then the bad will go away. So the one that killed it initially ends up getting its comeuppance in the end.
Yeah, and your teacher might ask you, you know, when it talks about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, you know, what are the purposes of the Book of Mormon, or what are some doctrines that are difficult to understand in the Bible but are plain and precious in the Book of Mormon? And there are lots of those. I mean, the Bible's great, but the Book of Mormon clarifies a lot in terms of, like, the lesson says, you know, the atonement, resurrection, baptism. How these are taught much more clearly in the Book of Mormon.
Well, so, like, obviously there's some great classics verses out of here, which hopefully you can take some time to discuss. We get our great and marvelous work coming forth out of these verses. This is, like, it's interesting to me to put myself in Nephi's shoes as a father of a young nation that doesn't really exist, and see, this is how the Lord would communicate His plan, and the role that He saw you playing with Nephi. And so, I don't know, kind of an interesting conversation to read through in these 3 chapters right here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, in the last chapter is 1 Nephi 14, the last section briefly, where he sees those blessings promised to the faithful, like you just said.
But again, why Columbus? Why Columbus?
Because he had to see that the gospel would be restored in the land where he was, in essence.
Then why America? Why couldn't we have done this in Spain?
Well, there was the whole Inquisition thing that caused problems.
There were a few
roadblocks.
factors.
It is funny when you look at the history of the world and how different America was originally, and it's hard not to have a testimony of how that was, despite its faults, but how that was set apart by the Lord to pave that way. And I like that in the church nowadays we celebrate a lot more, like the reformists from back.
Yep.
You know, in the past 5 years, you hear way more about Martin Luther and the like. And we talk more about Columbus, and there was not perfection there. These were not men who were inspired to do everything. But in one way or another, they laid the groundwork for the eventual restoration of the gospel, which is pretty fascinating.
Which makes a good point, right? Like the Lord doesn't necessarily wait for perfect people to do things.
Well, hardly. I mean, like we just said, like Columbus was not like his hands were not clean at all, but at the same time, it laid one necessary groundwork. And little by little, these things happened to make it possible. So
it's true. That's it. So you're now ready.
That's a good lesson.
You got lesson 4 rocking.
Lesson 4 is rocking hard. Al, thank you for doing this with us.
Jeff, always a pleasure.
Oh, pleasure. The pleasure is mine. And we hope you use this well and use it for your Sunday school and that it all goes well. You can find, of course, all of these things at thisweekinmormons.com. And you can find Sunday School Bonanza on iTunes, as well as our regular podcast of This Week in Mormons. There are links to all of which on our website. Also, Facebook.com/thisweekinmormons, at The Real Twim on Twitter. And please send us an email, contact at thisweekinmormons.com. We welcome
or come leave a comment. We like comments.
We like comments, and we welcome your feedback. You know, if you have suggestions on how we could
we encourage it.
There we go. Everybody, so thank you so much for tuning in. This has been Sunday School Bonanza, brought to you by This Week in Mormons. And we hope you have a good Sunday. Bye-bye.